Overview. The VHF Navigation System comprises 2 VOR, 2 DME and 2 ILS receivers. A marker receiver is also contained in VOR1. Frequency selection is by 2 VHF nav control panels on either end of the glare shield. VOR and DME information is displayed on the EFIS and the DBIs. ILS information is displayed on EFIS and the standby attitude indicator. Marker indications are displayed on both PFDs. The antennas for the VOR lock, glide slope, DME and marker are positioned at the front and bottom of the aircraft. Introduction. The VOR and lock receivers operate in the frequency range of 108 to 117.95 MHz. The system receives signals from the ground-based VOR transmitters and ILS glide slope localizer transmitters to provide deviation and bearing information for the flight deck displays. The DME provides slant range to the station. The co-located DME frequency is automatically tuned when the VHF frequency is selected on the VHF nav control panel. Each DME receiver has 5 channels, enabling the system to use 5 DMEs at once. 4 of the channels are automatically tuned by the GNSX to enable position information to be resolved by its internal VORTAC positioning unit, VPU. The VOR, ILS and DME systems are selected on by the relevant avionics master switch. Course selections are made on the Mode Control Panel, MCP, with a numerical readout of the selected course above the selection knob. The course pointer and deviation is displayed on the ND. Lateral deviation is also displayed on the PFD. Bearing pointers for VOR information can be displayed on the ND or DBI. VHF Navigation Controller. When the system is powered, the LCD display will show the previously selected active and standby frequencies. The active frequency is the current VOR or ILS in use, and the standby frequency is the next or previous frequency in use. To use a new frequency, it is first entered into the standby field. The large knob changes the frequency in steps of 1 MHz. The small knob changes the frequency in steps of 50 kHz. The current standby frequency is then made active by pressing the transfer button. The previous active frequency then becomes the standby. Presentation of VOR information. VOR course and deviation. Note that when VL is selected as the primary course on the ECP, VOR 1 appears on the captain's ND. To or from is displayed to indicate whether the aircraft is flying to or from the VOR beacon. Lateral deviation from the selected radial is displayed by the Course Deviation Indicator, CDI. The CDI consists of a course pointer and a lateral deviation beam bar. The CDI is displayed in green when VL is selected as the primary course. A VOR frequency must be selected on the controller for the CDI to appear, and a usable signal must be present to allow display of the beam bar. The deviation scale is calibrated in 5 degrees per dot. Note that on the PFD, the VOR lateral deviation scale indicates deviation to the same scale as the CDI. It is possible to display course and deviation information from the other pilot's side, known as the second course, by pressing the second course button on the ECP. VOR 2 now appears in cyan to indicate the selected second course. To prevent clutter, the lateral deviation scale is removed from the second course CDI. With VOR selected on the bearing control on the ECP, VOR is identified as the bearing source displayed on the ND. A double arrow indicates display of VOR 2, a single arrow indicates display of VOR 1. Both VOR 1 and VOR 2 bearings may be displayed on the DBIs by selecting the appropriate pointers on the DBI instrument. The CDI, bearing and to from indications are removed when the aircraft flies over the VOR. Selecting ARC on the format control on the ECP changes the format of the ND. When MAP is selected on the format control, the VOR information appears as a selected radial line drawn on a map. The line is solid on one side of the VOR symbol to indicate the to radial, and dashed on the other side to indicate the from radial. If the VOR does not have a co-located DME, a conventional course pointer and CDI is displayed. VOR ident. When a VOR has been selected, its audio identification must be confirmed before use. Each of the pilot's audio select panels contains a VOR rotational button. Pressing this button will enable the pilots to hear through their headsets and overhead speakers. Rotating the button towards 1 or 2 controls the volume of the identification signal. The Voice button suppresses the Morse code identification for use on VORs with an associated ATIS or other ATC broadcast information. An ILS button is provided, which allows identification of both ILS 1 and ILS 2. Presentation of ILS information. To display the ILS CDI on the ND, an ILS frequency must be selected on the VHF Nav controller and the course selection on the ECP set to VL. Note now that Lock 1 appears as the selected primary course, and the course pointer and CDI have changed to magenta. The glide slope deviation indicator is also displayed on the ND, but not in the map and plan formats. ILS deviation is automatically displayed on the PFD whenever an ILS frequency is made active. This function will override any displayed lateral deviation on the PFD as selected on the ECP course selector. ILS 1 or ILS 2 in magenta will be displayed in the bottom right-hand corner of the PFD to indicate the ILS source. The deviation displays on both the ND and PFD use the same white deviation scale of 1 dot representing conventional ILS deviation. For the PFD, it is shown as an expanded localizer. ILS number 1 localizer and glide slope deviation is displayed on the standby attitude indicator when a localizer frequency is selected on the captain's nav controller. Presentation of marker information. The aircraft's marker system automatically receives signals from outer, middle and inner markers on the approach. The marker system is also capable of receiving the few airways markers that still remain in service. As the aircraft flies over each marker, an associated symbol flashes at the bottom right of both PFDs and a tone is heard. A marker high-low switch on the flight annunciator panel selects the sensitivity of the marker receiver. The high position is used for the reception of an airways marker's weak signals due to aircraft's high altitude. The low position desensitizes the system for the accurate reception of approach markers. If the switch is in the high position on approach, it is possible to capture a marker prematurely, reducing the system's accuracy. Where can ILS number 2 navigational information be displayed in the flight deck? Presentation of DME information. If a selected VOR or ILS has a coupled DME, slant range is automatically displayed on both NDs and both DBIs. To indicate that the DME is coupled to a VOR or ILS, it is the same color: green for VOR, magenta for ILS. Each DBI displays both DME 1 and DME 2. Apart from the VOR and ILS, which other system on the aircraft can automatically tune the DMEs? Operation of the DME system. Each DME system is controlled by a rotary control on its associated nav controller. Standby. With the DME control set to the standby position, power is supplied to the DME interrogator when the avionics master switch is selected on. After a 1-minute warm-up period, the interrogator is operational, but its transmitter remains inhibited. Dashes are displayed on the DBIs and the ND. This means the system is operational, but is not receiving any information from the DME station. The DME readout on the ND is numbered and displayed in green when co-located with a VOR, or magenta when co-located with an ILS. In standby, it is possible to receive the identification signal from the DME station using the audio selector panel. On. With the DME control set to the on position and the warm-up complete, the DME interrogator is fully operational. Once the interrogator is available, it will automatically enter a search mode to find the ground station it has been tuned to. Dashes will be displayed. When the DME system has established contact with its ground station, slant distance to the station will be displayed. Hold. When the DME control is set to hold, the DME station at the time of selection is retained, regardless of subsequent frequency selections on the VHF nav controller. The VOR or ILS frequency associated with the DME is retained in the lower half of the controller display, and hold is displayed on the left of the controller display. A yellow H appears alongside the DME display on the ND. If a VOR or lock with a DME in hold is displayed as a second course, an advisory white H appears before the source indication. Subsequent VOR ILS frequency selections automatically tune the active frequency on the VHF nav controller display. VOR System Failure. With the failure of a VOR receiver or VHF nav controller, the following indications are given. VOR replaces VOR deviation at the bottom of the PFD. VOR replaces the green VOR legend at the top right of the ND. Beam bar removed from the ND to prevent nuisance information. Bearing pointer, removed from the ND to prevent nuisance information. Red pointer flag. A red flag will appear on the DBI, and the pointer will park horizontally to prevent nuisance information. Fail indications will only be displayed if VOR information has been selected to be displayed on the PFD, ND and DBIs. With no ground signal, the beam bar and bearing pointer are removed from the ND, and the lateral deviation scale is removed from the PFD. The bearing pointer on the DBI parks horizontally. ILS System Failure. With the failure of an ILS receiver or VHF nav controller, the following indications are given. Lock replaces lock deviation at the bottom of the PFD. GS replaces glide slope deviation on the right of the PFD and ND. Lock replaces the magenta lock legend at the top right of the ND. Beam bar removed from the ND to prevent nuisance information. Lock and GS flags. Red initialed flags are displayed on the standby attitude indicator with the loss of lock and/or glide slope. Fail indications will only be displayed if ILS information has been selected to be displayed on the PFD, ND and standby attitude indicator. DME System Failure. If a DME interrogator fails, the DME displays on the ND and DBIs will turn blank. If the VOR or ILS associated with the failed DME is being displayed as a second course, an advisory white D appears before the source indication. The VPU within the associated GNSX will be degraded. Marker System Failure. There is no indication given for the loss of the marker system. System operation at the emergency power level. If aircraft power is reduced to the emergency level, the system is degraded to Number 1 VHF Nav Controller, ILS number 1 deviation on the standby indicator, VOR number 1 bearing on number 1 DBI. System Test. A test button on each of the VHF nav controllers enables the testing of the following systems. On the captain's controller, VOR 1, ILS 1, DME 1 and the marker system. On the first officer's controller, VOR 2, ILS 2, DME 2. What happens to VOR indications on the EFIS when the aircraft flies over a VOR beacon? What indication is displayed if a DME station is out of range? When is it possible to make a direct change of the active frequency?